When people often discuss critics within media, arguably the most known critic of all time and the most impactful, especially in terms of the way we engage with criticism, has to be Ebert. You look at any film review that he's done and you just get how much he understands and appreciates the art form, as well as giving much due praise and credit to films that didn't get the attention of mainstream media, while also being able to establish his ideas in a way that doesn't come across as pretentious, but notably comes across as engaging to the common moviegoer. Ebert is someone you should always look up to, in my opinion, in terms of criticism, but notably me being in video games, Ebert and me, as well as a lot of people, notably will disagree with Ebert's own opinions on video games. More specifically, when he reviewed the adaptation of Doom, there was a question posed on whether or not knowing about Doom, the video game, would help understand the film better. Ebert didn't believe this, and not only did Ebert not believe this, paraphrasing here, he argued that no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramatists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. He argued that although a game can aspire to artistic importance, for the most part, games are just a representation of a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic. AKA, games are only used for escapism and to have fun. But in terms of other forms of art, it doesn't really compare, and it doesn't really come close. As you can expect, a lot of gamers and a lot of those who are in the game reviewer field saw Ebert's opinion is misinformed, as an old man yelling at the clouds towards technology, but he continued to defend his point later on, saying that one obvious difference between art and games is that you can win a game. It has rules, points, objectives, and an outcome. Santiago might cite an immersive game without points or rules, but I would say that it ceases to be a game and becomes a representation of a story, a novel, play, dance, film, etc. Now, of course, as he noted, there are notable objections to his own sort of rules and ideas of what a game is, but someone notable within the industry, someone who has impacted the industry and is arguably the closest thing video games have to an auteur for many, actually agreed with Ebert. None other than the creator of the Metal Gear franchise, as well as Policenauts, Snatcher, and Death Stranding, Hideo Kojima. 2006, a year after Ebert made those claims, Kojima noted that art is the stuff you find in the museum, whether it be a painting or a statue. What I'm doing, Kojima, what video game creators are doing, is running the museum. How do we light things up? Where do we place things? How do we sell tickets? Art is something that radiates the artist. If 100 people walk by and a single person is captivated, it's art. But to Kojima, video games are not like that. A video game cannot just capture one person. The goal of a video game is to make sure that all 100 people that play the game should enjoy the service provided by that game. Now, a lot of people would fundamentally disagree with Kojima. He's wrong on that. A lot of people would argue and say, oh, Kojima only says that because Kojima wants to make films. He wants to aspire to filmmaking. A take which, to be honest, if most people have actually played Kojima games, will fundamentally disagree with, because he's arguably one of the few big AAA creators that engages with video games as an art form and uses the context and mechanics of a game to represent that art form. But again, a lot of people would disagree. When I was younger, I would disagree. And I definitely see it with how many people vehemently argue against the claim that video games are not art. But then I think about a lot of how we talk about video games, especially in terms of aspects of identity, politics, race, etc. How many times have you heard when people bring up politics being in games that games should be escapism? I don't play games to deal with real world issues. I play games to get away from real world issues. And fundamentally, I get it, you know, video games are a form of escapism. But as I've grown older, as I've grown more acute in my taste and my understanding of not only myself, but the world around me, especially in terms of media representation, part of me's realized I don't really think that should be true. Because if we're gonna treat video games as just escapism, then I think Ebert and Kojima are right in saying that they aren't really art in themselves. Again, video games have been a fundamental part of my life ever since I was a kid. There are numerous video games that I continue to and have discussed and dissected as I would a novel or a book. There are multiple video game moments that have impacted me more so than some of the best films ever, such as Final Fantasy VII, the first season of Walking Dead, Kojima's own works. So I disagree, but I also have to agree. And again, going back to my first point about escapism, think about, for those who have been in the gaming community for so long, think about how many people paraded around the Reggie video of, if it's not fun, why bother? And to Reggie's credit, Reggie of Nintendo, or former Nintendo, to Reggie's credit, that statement makes sense for Nintendo, a company that fundamentally is making family-friendly games. But then you look at how Neil Druckmann, a creator who I might not agree with and might not like some of his works, noted that they didn't really consider the idea of fun when developing The Last of Us 2, a game that's about how violence is ultimately horrible and impacts people far just beyond the act. He notably got lambasted with the agreement that a game has to be fun to be enjoyable. So let's break that down. Because art does not have to be fun to be enjoyable. And I think the misunderstanding is the use of fun. A lot of people in gaming use fun for what I really think should be used as art has to be engaging. It does not have to be fun to watch. Come and See is a film that's been paraded by YouTubers and modern day critics as a phenomenal film. But anyone who's watched that knows that's not a fun film to watch. It's an incredibly harrowing film. Some of my favorite films are not fun films to watch necessarily, like Ichi the Killer, like Battle Royale. Some of my favorite books, some of the most acclaimed books within modern times are not fun books to experience, like Blood Meridian. Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy is one of the most paraded books on YouTube and in a lot of communities, right? It's not a fun book to read, and if you've read Blood Meridian, you know there are parts of that book that are just horrible to read, but it's engaging. And the creators of the works of art that I've noted didn't set out to have fun with the work. They set out to look at the human experience and use the human experience to provide themes in a way that are engaging, but they're not fun. So to start off with, the idea that a game has to be fun doesn't really have to be true. And I think so many games are limited by the idea and the notion that they have to be fun, especially in terms of games that want to engage with much more political or notably psychological themes, right? I think of Drakengard in Taro's work, how I wouldn't describe Drakengard 1 as a fun game. The violence and gameplay within it are utterly monotonous, but that's supposed to be the point of Drakengard 1. It's a perfect representation of how ugly and just brutal violence can be. Going back to Druckmann, actually, part of my struggle with liking The Last of Us Part 2 is actually its gameplay, and not in the sense of the critique of ludonarrative dissonance that a lot of people have noted with Druckmann's work and the whole, oh, I don't really want to play as Abby, or oh, it happens in a cutscene, but it doesn't happen in like the actual narrative. More so, for a game that wants to be about how ugly violence is, it can't really represent how ugly violence is within the base gameplay. There's ultimately satisfaction and enjoyment within that gameplay because it's a good gameplay system. No matter how many soldiers yell each other's names and then try to say, don't kill me, only for you to spare them and then instantly try to kill you, fundamentally the gameplay is fun and enjoyable to the point where to notable disdain from a lot of reviewers, adding the roguelike mode felt to them that they were kind of going against much of what The Last of Us Part 2 was trying to say with its combat loop. I think another aspect of the struggle to see video games as art in conjunction with being fun is the need for video games to adhere to certain metrics and industry standards in a way films do not have to. Some of the best films I've noted and some of the best films of this year don't adhere to the standards of their genre, or at best even subvert the standards of their genre. Dune Part 2 is such an incredible film because it frames the hero's journey and sense of self as a negative, with Paul finding himself and finding the inner path clearly being represented as a negative. The film ends as the Holy War, a war that, as Dune Messiah will show, will kill billions, as a negative. And Villeneuve even hits that harder than the book by having Shani being the voice of the Fremen and her disbanding Paul and going back out into the desert as he solemnly looks on upon his destiny. It manages to subvert chosen one and action hero tropes as a true villain-like turn. But video games, more often than not, are not allowed to do that, and more often than not, when a video game defies the tropes of the industry, it is lambasted both by critics and especially by fans. Metal Gear Solid 2's twist of Raiden, in retrospect, is utterly brilliant, both in terms of its themes of censorship, of control, and especially the meta-narrative context of the relationship between the player and the character. But anyone who was around knows when Metal Gear Solid 2 launched, it had immense hate and controversy from both critics and fans. Even to this day, you'll see old school gamers who fundamentally hate everything about Raiden and refuse to play Metal Gear Solid 2 because they got bamboozled when that twist happened and they never grew past it. But because it defied the norms of the video game industry at the time, what was a genuine brilliant twist was instead seen as an utter negative. Another example is Silent Hill 2, a game that many people would consider the greatest horror game ever made. You go back and look at some of Silent Hill 2's reviews, and you see a lot of criticism for a lot of the ways it uses its mechanics in comparison to its contemporary Resident Evil. Prime example. One of the main critiques of Silent Hill 2 is that for a horror game, it gives you a lot of ammo, and unless you're playing on the hardest difficulties, you never have to worry about ammo, health, or resources, and even by the end of the game, you'll be in abundance. A lot of people see that as a negative, but again, it's meant to be a defying subversion of the industry tropes. Silent Hill is a town that wants to torture those that are within it. It wants to make them suffer for as hard and as long as possible. It can't do that if they're dead. So it gives you enough you need to survive and enough ammo and resources you need to kill and maim anything in your way so it can torture you for even longer. It's a great way to represent how the town wants to endlessly push you through and endlessly have you experience the violence and torment that it loves to inflict upon you through, notably, gameplay, as well as the combat being notably sort of janky because James isn't a trained soldier like Stars or like Leon or Claire. He's a normal dude, so his combat's going to reflect that. And obviously it's shown its age, but everything ages, and having recently replayed Silent Hill 2 before I made this video, I still think the way it manages to achieve that sense of desperation within its storytelling is utterly phenomenal and fantastic. Critics are just to blame for this, such as in games using God Hand, but so are fans. I'm reminded of when Dragon's Dogma 2 came out, beyond the whole microtransaction debacle, so many people were frustrated and annoyed that this game did not have fast travel whatsoever, and its save system pretty much meant that you had to have consequences within it. But I personally loved it because it wanted to immerse you in the journey. It wanted to make every single choice you made and every single journey both have a sense of consequence and reward in a way that other games fundamentally did not and do not. But again, a lot of people saw those game designs as archaic And that sort of leads me into my next segment of why video games struggle in terms of an art form, especially with the way we discuss them. Age. We live in an age and time where remakes are more common and abundant than ever, and because of that, a lot of people fundamentally refuse to engage with any game that's not seen as modernized or has modernized mechanics. I can't tell you how many people just refuse to engage that I've seen online with games such as Final Fantasy VII, games such as Silent Hill 2, games such as the older Resident Evil remakes because they're quote-unquote outdated or too old. Even some of the most popular franchises of all time, like Dark Souls, will have people fundamentally refuse to engage with anything before DS3 because it's seen as fundamentally outdated. So many reviews and criticisms of the earlier Souls games don't give them the benefit of the doubt that they didn't have the quality of life aspects and innovations that were brought within later games, instead unfairly pitting them against later games as a sort of negative. You don't really see that with any other sense of art form. You don't really see film goers taking newer, better looking and more high definition films against old ones and say old films are unwatchable. It's just not how it works, right? Furiosa is fantastic, but I don't think you're gonna see a Mad Max enjoyer and fan say you shouldn't watch The Road Warrior. Because The Road Warrior is still a fantastic film, even in terms of remakes. You don't see Zack Snyder saying when he made Dawn of the Dead 2002, you shouldn't watch the original, right? You don't see people like Sam Raimi or Rob Tapert or Evil Dead fans saying you shouldn't watch Evil Dead 1981 because the Evil Dead remake exists. But time and time again, we see so many gamers, and I say gamers because it's really the common fan audience, refuse to engage with anything that might be seen as outdated. But there's sort of a notable hypocrisy to that because constantly they will also complain about how bad the industry's gotten. I do think that there needs to be some sort of understanding that you're gonna always engage with things that'll be outdated. One of the main things I learned, especially from development in COVID and seeing game developers talk about it, is more often than not, game ideas that were once hip when the game started development will come out and be outdated because of how long games take, for example. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had notable criticism towards its Ubisoft's open world, yet it started development where people still liked that open world. Lastly, I think my biggest problem, beyond the ability of people to engage with things older, beyond the ability of people to engage with things that have to be fun, that have to be engaging, that have to, entertain, is the need of quote-unquote objective criticism within gaming. Most film fans know, most music fans know, there's no such thing as an objective opinion when it comes to any of these art forms. There's too much to sort of talk about. Art hits people in a completely different way, etc., etc. Games are different. And to some extent, I understand criticisms from technical aspects. Not gameplay mechanics, not quality, but like technical aspects, right? That's why I kind of hate when people dogpile on channels like Digital Foundry for their technical aspects. They're not saying the games that they cover are bad. A lot of the games they cover they really like, but they're covering the genuine technical aspects, especially in a day where games release notably broken, buggy, etc., etc. That criticism, I think there is sort of an objective way. Like Callisto Protocol, objectively the game had technical issues. But when I look at things like Metacritic, when I look at a lot of critiques on YouTube, when I look at a lot of critiques on Twitter, you see the idea of objective criticism. This game is objectively bad. This game mechanic is objectively bad. Again, Dragon's Dogma 2, you had a lot of people saying the lack of fast travel is objectively bad, right? Or I remember a lot of people saying durability systems are objectively bad. Timed quests and time systems are objectively bad. And anyone who games and has gamed a lot know none of these are true. They can be implemented poorly, but some of the best games of all time implement unpopular mechanics. Dead Rising is one of the greatest games ever made, and the original release of Dead Rising 1 lacks an autosave system, has time quests and is built around a timer, and has a durability system. And one of the more notable things about that franchise is that they strip away each part of that identity, the games get worse. To buy Dead Rising 4, it's just a generic zombie game with nothing that made Dead Rising special for a lot of people. So just the idea of objective criticism, which was obviously popularized by YouTube video essays and channels like Malala, just makes talking about any type of game and discussing its art form just fundamentally a negative experience, when once again, more often than not, gamers are very reactionary, and years later you find a lot of ideas and opinions people had about games were just fundamentally misguided and or wrong. You know, like I think of From Software and Elden Ring, and how so many of the boss criticisms of that game were that they were objectively flawed. They had objectively unfair moves that you couldn't dodge. And then 6 months later, videos came out saying all of these moves are dodgeable and reactable. But even in terms of that objectivity also lends into the way we rate video games. People have talked about the problem with the Metacritic system for years on end, but just to reiterate, Metacritic is just not the best way to rate a game, and more often than not, it's a compilation of aggregate review scores from different review sites with different review metrics and grades. So from the jump, it's not going to be a perfect representation, right? But what makes it even worse is developers having to care about getting high Metacritic scores, like the director of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth noting they were trying to go for a high Metacritic score, juxtaposed with one of my favorite video game creators ever, Suda51, noting that in his creation of games, having to worry about Metacritic scores fundamentally frustrates him. He has ideas that are subversions of industry norms, but his team has to tell them, if you put this in there, the Metacritic score will go low. And that being able to ignore a Metacritic score is just not a luxury. And there are numerous studios that got low reviews that either got shut down or as a result can't make the games in the series they make because of how impactful Metacritic scores are, especially in terms of reviews. That isn't me, of course, saying that reviewers have to hold their tongue about how a game might be good or bad. I don't think reviewers should do that. But again, I think we as fans take too much stock into trying to give objective value onto what we consider art. Because I can assure you, Ebert would tell you that art is subjective. Fantano would tell you that his music opinions are subjective. It's just his opinion. But in terms of games, every opinion we have about a game has to be objective. So ultimately, are video games, are, in my opinion, I think they are. But I think they are the art form that is most affected by aspects of capitalism and fan demand. Video games have to have aspects that help them hit high Metacritic scores and aspects that have them give more sales and revenue. Video games also have to be impacted by fans in a way no other media format is. There's so much working against video games as a format and as art. And I hope as we continue into this art form maturing that maybe we can understand that. Maybe instead of trying to meet games in terms of an industry standard, maybe we can meet them at their own merits. Some of my favorite games have been lambasted by Metacritic. I love Suda51. His only games that I know of that have received above an 80 on Metacritic are the first 2 No More Heroes games, and that's it. Silent Hill 2, considered the greatest horror game of all time, does not reach 90 on Metacritic, right? I just hope we can engage with the idea that video games can be engaging, but they can be challenging, they can be upsetting, they can even be miserable. And thankfully, I don't think any of the game developers within the industry have lost sight of that. Mouthwashing was yet an incredible example of how to make an utterly miserable experience, but making it into an incredible narrative experience. I also do hope that we talk about games and how they divulge into the art form while also noting about gameplay mechanics, right? I think so much of what the industry sees in terms of video games being art is cinematics and presentation and akin to movies. But again, so many of my favorite games use them being a video game to represent how perfect of an art form they are. Yoko Taro and the Nier games directly use being a video game in order to represent themselves. Or how video games can be a show of exhibition in terms of art, right? Like Devil May Cry is just as much art as The Last of Us, having the ability to string together combos and being challenged on game knowledge and game depth, as well as allowing your own creativity to blossom. That's art. Or the puzzles within Portal and being able to challenge the player in new and invigorating ways by using their brain. That's art as well. So yeah, video games are art. I don't think anybody will disagree, but I think if we're going to engage with them in terms of being an art form, we need to engage with them earnestly, and maybe we need to redirect how we engage with them. That was my short talk. Short. I hope those who are watching enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something new and maybe reevaluate how you look at video games. As always, thank you for watching, and peace.